Symbolic violence in Venezuela operates as a silent yet effective tool. It doesn't need military uniforms or visible weapons. It shows itself in gestures, in images, in narratives that shape what can be said, felt, or even thought. When a citizen reported that the flour from the CLAP program, the government-run food distribution scheme, contained worms, the system didn't just respond with repression, but with public humiliation. The video of her arrest, released by the local police station itself, shows her apologizing to the president for speaking out. Her suffering was turned into a warning, a disciplinary spectacle. This scene does not seek justice, it seeks obedience.
Mi nombre es Iris Margarita Rincón Villamil, de la cédula de identidad 16-919-722. El día 28 de julio me dejé influenciar por una persona de identidad colombiana, la cual me pagó $50 para que hiciera un video y lo subiera al TikTok ofendiendo a nuestro presidente, Nicolás Maduro, en la cual me siento muy arrepentida de haberlo hecho. Yo recibo todos los beneficios que nos da. Me encuentro en el comando de la Guardia Nacional Bolivariana en el destacamento 111, Puerto de Maracaibo. Le pido perdón a mi presidente Nicolás Maduro y al país.
Programs like El Mazo Dando and visual campaigns such as the Eyes of Chavez murals serve a similar purpose. They rewrite violence as patriotism and frame repression as a moral duty.
Escuálidos que me oís. Viene una operación Tuntún para los que dieron plata ahí.
El Mazo publicly exposes opposition members, including minors, while the state glorifies operations like the Knock Knock operation, in which citizens are arrested in their homes without due process. Rather than hide these practices, the government's media apparatus celebrates them, turning oppression into a heroic narrative. Cultural violence, as defined by Johan Galtung, is precisely this system of discourse. Symbols and customs that legitimizes or naturalizes direct or structural violence.
Tum tum. No seas llorón, vas pa tocorom. No seas llorón, vas pa tocorom.
When the president declares on national TV, "Don't be a crybaby, you're going to jail," he doesn't just normalize abuse, he turns it into a joke, something deserved. The message is clear: to question is to betray, and punishment is the rule. This symbolic machinery has one goal: to discourage resistance and condition submission. In Venezuela, violence doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stares down from a mural. Structural violence, as defined by Johan Galtung, is a form of violence that doesn't manifest through direct physical aggression, but is embedded within social, economic, and political structures. It occurs when institutions or systems prevent people from meeting their basic needs or realizing their full potential. It is an invisible kind of violence, but it causes real suffering: poverty, inequality, and limited access to healthcare, education, or justice. Not because resources are lacking, but because of the way power relations are organized. The Ministry of Health has failed the Venezuelan public in its duty. Amnesty International's 2023 report on Venezuela's healthcare system revealed alarming facts. It documented a collapse of the system due to a lack of supplies and trained personnel to maintain the medical and surgical equipment. Nearly 55% of public hospitals have no consistent access to clean water. And during the first 3 quarters of 2023, 130 people died as a result of frequent power outages. These conditions, alongside the widespread shortage of medical supplies, are living proof of the Ministry of Health's disastrous management. In addition, there have been reports of intimidation against healthcare workers who have spoken out about the system's deficiencies and their extremely low salaries. It's also worth noting that 90% of patients had to procure the medical supplies necessary for their recovery on their own. This situation is a clear example of a structural violence. Only those with the economic means to afford these supplies have a real chance at improving their condition. The Ministry of Education has failed the Venezuelan public in its duty. The condition of educational institutions continues to deteriorate due to the ministry's lack of support for both public and private schools across the country. Teachers in Venezuela earn the lowest salaries in the region and among the lowest in the world, which is one of the main reasons for the shortage of qualified educators. In 2023, it was reported that 18% of minors did not attend school, and nearly half of all students had irregular attendance. Teachers' protests have simply been repressed and silenced. This type of violence is directly connected to Johan Galtung's concept of a structural violence, as those who cannot afford private education are forced into a declining system, one that limits the human potential of Venezuela's youth. The Ministry of Penitentiary Services has proven no better than its counterparts. The families of inmates are directly affected by the structural violence caused by the negligent management of Venezuela's prison system. Inmates live in overcrowded prisons with no access to medical care, clean water, or food. These conditions create an environment where preventable diseases can easily spread among the incarcerated population. The overcrowding has allowed criminal groups to take control of many prisons. Even though the government recently intervened in 7 facilities, inmates are still forced to pay considerable weekly sums to imprisoned gang members in exchange for protection. Protection in this context can mean securing a bed or simply avoiding being killed in a conflict. These financial burdens fall on the inmates' families, who are forced to come up with the money week after week to ensure their loved ones' safety inside the prison system. This form of structural violence becomes yet another obstacle for the families of those behind bars. The Venezuelan state has institutionalized repression as a direct response to dissent. Since 2014, over 15,700 people have been arbitrarily detained for participating in protests, denouncing abuses, or simply expressing opinions contrary to the regime. By 2023, more than 9,000 individuals remained under politically motivated judicial restrictions, many of them without a fair trial or due process guarantees. The government has weaponized specialized terrorism courts to judge peaceful protesters, unionists, and students, criminalizing the right to protest. Cases of forced disappearances, torture, and detentions without judicial orders are common. Only 10 out of the 455 documented cases of forced disappearance have gone to trial, and in most of them, the whereabouts of the victims remain unknown. This selective punishment practice is not only aimed at intimidation, but also seeks to destroy any form of social organization or political resistance. This structural violence demonstrates how the state uses its judicial power as a weapon of control and repression, systematically violating human rights under the guise of legality. Impunity in Venezuela is a key characteristic of structural violence. The lack of accountability within the judicial system and institutionalized corruption have allowed those responsible for serious human rights violations to remain free from punishment. Despite reports of extrajudicial executions and torture by security forces, authorities have taken no meaningful steps to investigate these crimes. The symbolic dissolution of the Special Action Force, or FAES by its initials in Spanish, has not halted the continuation of these abuses, which have persisted in new forms and units. The UN investigation mission was unable to enter the country, reinforcing the idea that the judicial system is complicit and unwilling to deliver justice for victims of state violence. In Venezuela, the criminalization of abortion and limited access to contraception and maternal care have created an environment of structural violence that primarily affects low-income women. The lack of clinics, trained medical personnel, and accessible public services forces many women to resort to unsafe practices or face complications during pregnancy that could have been avoided with proper care. The collapsed healthcare system has left many women with no viable options to protect their reproductive health, resulting in high maternal mortality rates. This structural violence manifests when the system prevents women from exercising their reproductive rights, putting their life and well-being at risk, simply because they lack access to adequate medical care. In Venezuela, being a woman represents a structural disadvantage within the social and legal system. Gender-based violence, femicides, and the disappearance of women occur with the alarming frequency and almost total impunity. Despite the severity of the situation, the country has only 5 shelters for victims of gender-based violence across the entire national territory. There are no effective gender-focused investigation protocols, and the lack of a national statistical system prevents an accurate understanding of the scope of this violence. Women who report violence are often ignored or re-victimized by the institutions that should protect them. Furthermore, access to women-specific health services such as gynecological care, contraception, or psychological assistance is limited or non-existent in many areas of the country. This reality reveals how the state has failed in its duty to guarantee women's fundamental rights, perpetuating a cycle of violence, neglect, and impunity that affect thousands. The lack of state action in the face of this crisis is a clear example of structural violence, with devastating consequences for Venezuelan women. Illegal mining in the Orinoco mining arc has had a devastating impact on Venezuela's indigenous communities. Indigenous groups such as the Guarao of the Orinoco Delta and the Guayú of the Northwest face forced displacement due to mining exploitation and the armed violence that accompanies these activities. In many cases, indigenous defenders of their lands and rights are murdered, as was the case of Virgilio Trujillo Arana, whose assassination remains unsolved. Environmental damage is another form of structural violence, as the destruction of ecosystems in indigenous territories has increased significantly. Deforestation in the Amazon region grew by 25% in 2020, with more than half of this destruction concentrated in indigenous lands, which are being devastated by illegal mining. This structural violence not only affects indigenous communities through the dispossession of their lands, but it also harms future generations whose natural resources are being ravaged without their consent, worsening living conditions and forcing many communities to flee in search of safety and dignified living conditions. The pervasive structural violence in Venezuela is a result of systemic neglect, corruption, and repression that affects every aspect of life, from healthcare and education to environmental rights and personal freedoms. The government's failure to address these injustices not only harms individuals, but also perpetuates a cycle of inequality and suffering. It is imperative that the international community acknowledges the depth of this crisis and works towards meaningful change to ensure justice, dignity, and human rights for all Venezuelans.